Tonight, the weight of the world has settled upon your shoulders with a density that leaves you breathless. If you've come here because sleep eludes you and the hours stretch out in the darkness like an endless road, I want you to know that you are not alone, that there is a loving presence accompanying you even when all seems silent. Perhaps today has been too long. Perhaps worries have followed you to your pillow like restless shadows. Perhaps there is an old or recent pain that has decided to visit you tonight unannounced. Whatever has brought you here, allow yourself to release, even if only for these few hours, the weight you carry. You don't have to resolve anything right now. You don't have to be strong. You only have to listen and let yourself be lulled by a story that began almost 200 years ago in a small corner of France. A story of darkness that found light, of poverty that discovered the riches of heaven, of a girl forgotten by the world who was remembered by God. Welcome to Saints to Sleep, Saints. Tonight we will walk together along the trails of the French Pyrenees, those majestic mountains that rise between France and Spain like guardians of stone and snow, and descend to a small village called Lourdes, a place that meant nothing to anyone back then, barely a handful of houses huddled beside a river of cold, crystal-clear water called the Gave de Pau. It was a world of farmers and millers, of shepherds who took their flocks up to the high pastures when summer arrived, of women washing clothes on the riverbanks, and of children growing up amidst work and poverty, knowing nothing else. A world where life was hard but simple, where faith was passed down from mothers to children, like the bread needed each morning, where the church bells mark the rhythm of the days and the season. In that world, in that small forgotten town at the foot of the mountains, there was a mill called Bowley's Mill. And in that mill, on January 7th, 1844, a girl was born who would receive the name Maria Bernarda at her baptism, although everyone would always call her by the affectionate diminutive of her second name, Bernardita. The Bowley Mill was a modest but dignified place, a stone and wood structure that stood beside a water channel whose current turned the large millstone. There lived and worked Bernadette's parents, François Soubirous and Louise Castereau. He was a miller by trade, as his father and his father's father had been before him. She was a pious and hard-working woman who had brought to the marriage not riches, but a generous heart and unwavering faith. They had married a year earlier, on January 9th, 1843, in the parish church of St. Peter in Lourdes. And now, on the first anniversary of their religious wedding, they were baptizing their first daughter in that same church, promising before God to raise her in the Catholic faith and teach her to love the Lord above all things. Bernadette's early years were spent in the relative prosperity of the mill. They weren't rich, certainly, but neither were they in need. Wheat arrived from the nearby fields, the millstones turned, transforming the grain into flour. Sacks were filled and sold, and there was bread on the table and firewood in the hearth when winter came. Louise looked after the house and the children who came after Bernadette. First a girl named Jeanne, who died a few months after birth. Then Marie, whom they called Toinette, and later several boys. The family grew, the mill turned, and life seemed to follow its predictable and tranquil course, like the waters of the Gave that never ceased to flow. Bernadette was a small child, delicate from the start, with large dark eyes that seemed to gaze at the world with a mixture of wonder and serenity that captivated those who knew her. She wasn't particularly beautiful or particularly clever. She didn't excel in anything the world considered valuable, but there was a natural sweetness about her, a simple joy that blossomed even in difficult times, a capacity for wonder at small things that adults had forgotten. She liked to help her mother with the housework, look after her younger siblings, and listen to the stories the adults told by the fire on winter nights. She loved praying the rosary with her mother, repeating the prayers Louisa taught her with infinite patience, feeling that there was someone in heaven listening to her, even though she was so small and insignificant. Bowley's Mill was her whole world, the only home she knew, the place where she had learned to walk and talk, where she had uttered her first prayers and first felt the protective love of her parents. She could not have imagined then, in those early years of innocence, that this world was about to collapse, that the millstones would cease to turn, that her family's modest prosperity would turn into abject poverty, and that she, the youngest and most fragile, would be cast into a darkness that seemed to have no end. But that would come later. For now, as little Bernadette played in the mill yard, watching the great water wheels turn, listening to the steady murmur of the canal, and smelling the freshly ground flour that permeated every corner of the house, everything seemed to be in its place. For now, Bolly's mill kept turning, and no one could know that heaven had other plans for that family. Plans that led them through the darkest valley before reaching the brightest light the world had ever known. Perhaps you too remember a time when things seemed to be in place, a time before the storms arrived that transformed your life. Perhaps tonight, as you listen to this story, there is a part of you that longs for that lost security, that home that no longer exists, that innocence that time has taken away. Time. If so, I want you to know that God has not forgotten that time, that He keeps in His heart every moment of peace you have known, and that all the good you have experienced is not lost, but awaits you, transfigured and eternal, in the final home He has prepared for you. But the path to that home sometimes passes through night, through loss, through the stripping away of everything we thought was secure. And it was precisely that path that little Bernadette was about to travel, the fall into the abyss. The years following Bernadette's birth brought a succession of misfortunes that struck the Soubirous family with a seemingly endless cruelty, as if a curse had settled upon the mill that had once turned with such prosperity. The world was changing in those mid-19th century years, and the changes were not kind to those who made their living from ancient trades like milling. The Industrial Revolution had reached even the remote valleys of the Pyrenees, bringing with it new steam mills that could operate without relying on river water, faster, more efficient, and cheaper. Old watermills like Bolly's began to lose customers, as farmers preferred to take their wheat to the new mills that promised more flour in less time and at a lower price. And as if the competition from the steam mills weren't enough, the heavens themselves seemed to turn against the Soubirous family. Years of terrible droughts plagued the region, drying up the fields and ruining the crops. Where once golden wheat had grown to feed the mills, now there was only parched earth and withered plants. The peasants had no grain to grind because there had been no harvest, and without grain to grind, the Bolly mill fell silent, its great millstones motionless, its water channel running uselessly with nothing to turn. Francisco Soubirous was a good, hard-working man, but he was unprepared to face that storm of misfortunes. He tried to adapt, looked for other jobs, and went into debt to support his family, while he waited for times to improve, but times didn't. The debts mounted, and the creditors lost patience. And then, as if all of the above hadn't been enough, came the accident that would forever mark the life of that simple man. Working in a quarry to earn a few extra francs, a splinter of stone flew and shattered his left eye. Francisco Soubirous was blind in one eye for the rest of his days, his body marked by the cruelty of a fate that seemed intent on tormenting him. But the worst was yet to come. In those times of poverty, when the family barely had enough to eat, someone accused Francisco of stealing sacks of flour from the village bakery. It was a false accusation, born perhaps of envy or the contempt that the poor often inspire in those who have a little more, but the authorities didn't bother to investigate further. Francisco was arrested and spent a week in the Lourdes jail, publicly humiliated, branded a thief before all his neighbors. Although he was released for lack of evidence, the damage had already been done. The Soubirous name was forever tarnished in that small town, where everyone knew each other, and where rumors spread faster than the waters of the Gave River. Perhaps you too have experienced that kind of humiliation, that terrible feeling of being unjustly accused, of watching your name dragged through the mud while you can do nothing to defend yourself. Perhaps you felt how other people's expressions change when rumors start to circulate, how friends distance themselves and acquaintances cross the street to avoid greeting you? If so, then you can understand what that family felt when the father returned from prison with his head down and a broken heart, knowing that, although he was innocent, the world had already condemned him. After the humiliation of prison, everything spiraled out of control. The Soubirous family lost the Bolly Mill for good, the home where Bernadette had been born and spent the first years of her life. They had to pack up their few remaining belongings and look for another place to live. But with their reputation ruined and no money, their options were limited. They found a smaller, cheaper room, and when they could no longer afford even that, they found an even smaller one, and then another, each time darker, damper, more wretched. The family descended step by step into the abyss of extreme poverty, as if an invisible hand were pulling them down with no way to stop. Bernadette was 10 years old when the family lost the mill, and although she was just a child, she understood perfectly what was happening. She saw her father's gaunt face, the dark circles under her mother's eyes, and heard the muffled cries in the night when the adults thought the children were asleep. She saw how their clothes wore out and there was no money to replace them, how their meals became increasingly scarce, how the bread that had once been plentiful on the mill table now had to be shared among many hungry siblings. She saw all this and kept it in her heart without complaining, because she had learned from her mother that complaining changes nothing and that only prayer can give the strength to endure the unbearable. Little Bernadette couldn't have known then that this fall into the abyss was part of a larger plan, that God was setting the stage for something that would change the course of history. She couldn't have known that the extreme poverty she was about to experience would be precisely the condition necessary for heaven to take notice of her. Because God always chooses the small, the forgotten, those whom the world considers insignificant, to perform his greatest works. But that would come later. For now, as the family packed their meager belongings once again to move to an even more wretched place, the future seemed as dark as the clouds gathering over the peaks of the Pyrenees. Francisco Soubirous, the man who had been a miller like his father and grandfather, was forced to take the humblest jobs to feed his family. He worked as a day labourer in other people's fields, carried bundles, cleaned stables, did anything he could find for a few cents. And when even that wasn't enough, when the shame of poverty became unbearable, he accepted the most despised job of all, collecting the town's and hospital's garbage. The former miller, the man who had known days of dignity and honest work, now walked the streets of Lourdes gathering the trash that others threw away, while the neighbours who had once greeted him with respect now looked away or whispered behind his back. Louisa, Bernadette's mother, did what she could to keep the family together and maintain a semblance of dignity amidst such misery. She sewed clothes for others whenever she could find someone to do it, washed clothes in the river with hands chapped by the cold, and cared for her children with a fierce love that refused to give up even when all seemed lost. She was the one who kept the flame of faith alive in that desolate home, who gathered the children at night to pray the rosary, who reminded them that God had not forgotten them, even though appearances suggested otherwise. She was the one who taught Bernadette that true wealth lies not in things that can be lost, but in the love of God that endures forever. And so, amidst growing poverty and a faith that refused to die, the Soubirous family finally reached the last step of their descent, the darkest and most miserable place they could imagine, the site that would become the unlikely setting for the greatest spiritual event of the 19th century. They arrived at Cachot, El Cachot, the prison of the innocent in Lourdes. There was a building everyone knew and everyone avoided, a dark stone structure on the Rue de Petit Diès that had served for years as the town jail until the authorities closed it down, deeming it uninhabitable, too damp, too dark, too unsanitary even for the prisoners. It was called the Cachot, which in French means dungeon, and that's exactly what it was. A cell barely 4 meters by 4, with no proper ventilation, a single small window that let in hardly any light, walls that oozed dampness, and an earthen floor that turned to mud when it rained. A place where, In the words of the imperial procurator who ordered its closure, no human being could live with dignity. And yet, it was to this place that the Soubirous family arrived in 1856, when there was nowhere else they could afford. A cousin of Francisco named André Sajous owned the building and, moved by compassion for his relatives in distress, offered them a place to stay rent-free. It wasn't a favor, but charity, the last resort of those who had hit rock bottom. But Francisco and Luisa were in no position to refuse anything, so they packed their meager belongings once more, gathered their children, and crossed the threshold of the Cachot to settle into that abandoned dungeon that would be their home for the next few years. Try to imagine, if you can, what it was like to live in that place. A single room for a family of 8. The father, the mother, and 6 children, all crammed together on straw mattresses spread out on the dirt floor. A single window overlooking a gloomy alley, barely letting in enough light to make out faces during the day. Walls covered in damp patches that emitted a musty smell that never quite left. A bone-chilling, damp cold in winter, and a stifling heat in summer that made the air almost unbreathable. And above all, the shame of living in the old village jail, of being singled out as those who had fallen so low that they slept where criminals once slept. Bernadette was 12 years old when the family settled in Cachot, and although she never complained, her frail body suffered terribly in that unsanitary environment. She had already contracted cholera during the epidemic that ravaged Lourdes the previous year, and although she survived, the illness left her with after effects that would accompany her for the rest of her life. Chronic asthma that made breathing difficult and was aggravated by the damp and cold of the dungeon. There were nights when Luisa would wake to the sound of her eldest daughter's cough, a dry, persistent cough that seemed to steal the air from her lungs. And she would go to her in the darkness to hold her in her arms and pray silently, asking God to protect her. Perhaps tonight, as you listen to these words, you too know what it is like to feel locked in your own darkness, trapped in circumstances that seem to offer no escape, surrounded by walls that close in on you and steal your breath. Perhaps there is something in your life that resembles the Cachot of the Soubirous family, a place of shame, of want, of silent humiliation that no one else can see. If so, I want you to know that God knows that place. He was with Bernadette in that damp, dark dungeon, and He is with you now in whatever dungeon you may find yourself in. He has not abandoned you, even though everything seems to indicate otherwise. The Cachot is not the end of the story. In that dungeon, daily life was a constant struggle against poverty. There wasn't enough money to feed all the children, and many nights supper consisted of a crust of bread that had to be divided among many hungry mouths. Bernadette, as the eldest sister, often gave her share to the younger ones, telling them she wasn't hungry, when in reality, her stomach growled with need. There weren't enough clothes for everyone, and when Bernadette had to wash the only dress she owned, she had to stay in the Cachot, wrapped in an old blanket while she waited for it to dry. There was no money to send the children to school, so while other children her age learned to read and write, Bernadette spent her days looking after her younger siblings, or seeking work as a shepherdess for other people's sheep in the nearby mountains. The Soubirous family's poverty was not only material, but also social. In the small town of Lourdes, where everyone knew each other, the family was singled out and scorned. Neighbors would whisper as they passed by, "There go those who live in the jail, the children of the alleged thief, the wretches who don't even have enough to eat." Children from other families were forbidden to play with the Soubirous children, as if poverty were a contagious disease. Doors were closed when Bernadette or her siblings approached, glances were averted, and conversations were interrupted. They were invisible, forgotten, and mattered to no one. And yet, in the midst of that darkness, there was a light that refused to be extinguished. Louise Soubirous, Bernadette's mother, kept the flame of faith alive with a determination that defied all logic. Every night, no matter how tired she was, she gathered her children at the Cachot to pray the rosary together. She taught them that God especially loved the poor, that Jesus had been born in a stable and had lived without a place to lay his head, that the Virgin Mary knew the suffering of seeing her son rejected and despised. She taught them that true wealth was not what was kept in chests, but what was kept in the heart, and that no material poverty could take away the treasure of faith and the love of God. Bernadette absorbed these teachings with a thirst beyond her years. Although she couldn't read or write, she had memorized the main prayers of the Catechism and repeated them with a devotion that moved those who heard her. Her greatest desire was to make her first communion, to receive Jesus into her heart as she had seen other children her age do, but for that she needed to know the entire Catechism, and the Catechism was difficult to memorize without knowing how to read. So every night, after long hours of work, little Bernadette would sit in a corner of the Cachot and quietly repeat the lessons her mother taught her, striving to etch into her memory words she couldn't read in any book. The village school teacher, who occasionally agreed to teach poor children, said of her, "She struggles to memorize the Catechism because she can't read, but she tries very hard. She's very attentive, and especially very pious and modest." That was Bernadette. Not the smartest or the most capable, but certainly the most persevering, the one who compensated with effort and devotion for what she lacked in education and resources. A girl whom the world considered insignificant, but who was being secretly prepared for something the world couldn't even imagine. El Cachot, that place of shame and suffering, was about to become the starting point of a story that would change millions of lives. For God, who always writes straight with crooked lines, had chosen precisely that dark dungeon as the place from which his messenger would depart. He did not choose a mansion or a palace. He did not choose the daughter of a nobleman or a priest, but that wretched hole and that ignorant girl who could barely breathe because of her asthma. Thus heaven works, choosing the weak of the world to confound the strong, the foolish to confound the wise, that which is not to reduce to nothing that which is. But before the light arrived, Bernadette would have to pass through even more darkness, for poverty and illness were not the only sufferings that awaited her. There was something else the girl from Cachot would have to endure before heaven opened above her. The loneliness of someone who didn't belong anywhere, the incomprehension of those who should have loved her, the silence of a God who seemed not to answer her prayers. Only after going through all of that, only after being stripped of everything the world considers valuable, would she be ready to receive the greatest gift ever given to a human being. To see with her own eyes the face of the Mother of God, the girl who couldn't read but knew how to pray. In those difficult years at Cachot, while the Soubirous family struggled daily to survive, Bernadette grew in age and in something difficult to name, but easy to recognize when you find it. An inner depth, a peace that didn't depend on external circumstances, an ability to find joy in the smallest things when everything around her spoke of sadness and want. Those who knew her were amazed that this sick and malnourished child, this daughter of the destitute in the dungeon, could smile so easily and display a serenity that many adults with prosperous lives couldn't achieve. It wasn't that Bernadette didn't suffer. She suffered, and greatly. She suffered when her asthma tightened its grip on her chest, stealing her breath on cold Pyrenean winter nights. She suffered when she saw her father return from work exhausted and humiliated, when she saw her mother weep silently, believing no one was watching. She suffered when her younger siblings begged for more food and there was nothing left to give them, when she had to wear patched clothes so many times that almost no original fabric remained. She suffered when the village children mocked her for being poor, for being ignorant, for living in the dungeon where prisoners once slept. But there was something about Bernadette that transformed suffering into something else, something that didn't eliminate it, but made it bearable, even meaningful. That something was her faith, a simple and profound faith that she had absorbed from her mother, and that had become the center of her inner life. For Bernadette, God was not an abstract idea or a religious obligation, but a real and close presence, someone she could speak to at any time of day or night, someone who listened to her even if no one else did, someone who loved her even if the whole world despised her. Perhaps you too have experienced that kind of faith at some point in your life, That simple trust that there is someone greater who cares for you, even though you cannot see or prove it. Or perhaps tonight you feel far from that faith. Perhaps the circumstances of your life have gradually eroded your capacity to believe in a good God who cares for his children. If so, do not judge yourself harshly. Faith is not a human achievement, but a gift that is received. And sometimes that gift seems to hide precisely when we need it most. Bernadette, too, would know that silence of God, that dark night in which prayers seem to bounce off a stone sky. But even in that night, she continued to pray. What Bernadette longed for most in those years was to make her first communion. She had seen other children her age dress in white and approach the altar to receive the body of Christ for the first time, and her heart burned with desire to experience that moment. But to make First Communion, one had to know the catechism, and Bernadette, who hadn't been able to attend school, barely knew the basic prayers her mother. The parish priest of Lourdes was strict on this point. No child could receive communion without demonstrating knowledge of the fundamentals of the faith, and Bernadette, try as she might, couldn't memorize all the required answers. So the girl from Cachot studied as best she could, repeating the catechism formulas over and over after long days of work. While other girls her age played or rested, Bernadette sat in a dark corner of the dungeon and murmured softly, "Who is God? God is our Heavenly Father. How many persons are there in God? In God there are 3 persons." The words escaped her, mingled, and became confused in her tired mind, but she started again and again, with a perseverance that moved her mother and exasperated her teachers. The Sisters of Charity of Nevers ran a hospice in Lourdes where they cared for the poor and the sick, and they also operated a small school for girls from impoverished families. Bernadette attended this school whenever she could, when she wasn't working, tending sheep or helping out in the village, but her absences were frequent and her progress was slow. The sisters described her as a docile and pious child, but of limited intelligence, unable to retain even the simplest lesson. They couldn't have known that this girl, who seemed so clumsy with her studies, was being educated by a different kind of teacher, one who taught not with books or exams, but with the silence of the heart, because Bernadette, though she couldn't read or write, knew how to pray like few others. She understood prayer not as a mechanical recitation of learned formulas, but as a real conversation with someone who loved her. When she prayed the rosary, her fingers moving over the worn beads her mother had given her, she entered a state of such deep concentration that the world around her seemed to fade away. The damp walls of the Cachot, the smell of mold, the noises of the street, everything was suspended as she contemplated in her heart the mysteries of the lives of Jesus and Mary. It was as if, in those moments of prayer, the poor sick girl in the dungeon was transported to another place, a place where there was no hunger, no cold, no shame, only the warm presence of a love that filled everything. This capacity for deep prayer, this natural intimacy with the divine, was not something Bernadette had learned in any school or from any book. It was a free gift, a grace bestowed upon her without any merit on her part, perhaps precisely because she had no merits to boast of. Those who consider themselves wise and capable rarely receive these gifts, because their wisdom and ability lead them to believe they don't need them. But the little ones, the ignorant, those who know they know nothing, these are empty and available to be filled by God. Bernadette's faith also possessed a characteristic that would prove crucial in the events to come. It was utterly honest. Bernadette neither exaggerated nor embellished. She neither invented nor added anything to what she knew for certain. When asked something she didn't know, she simply said she didn't know. When she didn't understand something, she confessed her ignorance without shame. This radical honesty, which some mistook for naivete or clumsiness, was in reality a rare and precious virtue. the very virtue that would later allow her to recount exactly what she had seen and heard without adding or omitting anything, without being intimidated by the powerful or seduced by flatterers. Meanwhile, life in Cachot continued its difficult and monotonous course. Francisco worked collecting garbage and doing any job he could find. Luisa sewed, washed, and cared for the children. Bernadette's younger siblings grew up as best they could in that environment of poverty. And Bernadette, the eldest, helped in every way she could. She looked after her siblings when their parents worked, went to the mountains to gather firewood when needed, and herded other people's sheep in exchange for a few coins. Her frail and ailing body strained beyond its limits, and many nights she collapsed onto the straw mattress, too weak even to say her evening prayers. And yet, in the midst of that grey and exhausting life, there were moments of light. Moments when the winter sun pierced the Cachot's single window and painted a golden rectangle on the earthen floor. Moments when the family gathered to pray the rosary, their voices mingling in a shared prayer that seemed to lift them above their misery. Moments when Bernadette gazed at the snow-capped Pyrenees and felt something in her heart that she couldn't name, a mixture of wonder, gratitude, and longing that made her think there was something beyond all of this, something beautiful and good waiting for her somewhere she didn't yet know. That something was about to be revealed. The winter of 1858 had arrived in Lourdes with a colder intensity than usual, a cold that made the Soubirous family shiver in their unheated cellar, a cold that aggravated Bernadette's asthma and made her cough for hours in the darkness of the night. The firewood had run out, and there was no money to buy more. Someone would have to go and gather wood from the mountains, from the riverbanks where branches sometimes accumulated, carried by the current. And it was precisely this need, this lack as prosaic as the lack of firewood to keep warm, that led Bernadette to the place where heaven was waiting for her. The day the wind blew from the sky. It was Thursday, February 11th, 1858, and the cold of that Pyrenean winter had settled in Lourdes like a guest who had no intention of leaving. In the Cachot, the Soubirous family shivered under threadbare blankets, while the wind whistled through the cracks of the poorly fitted door, and the little firewood they had left had burned down, leaving only cold ashes in the small hearth. More wood was needed to survive the cold, so Louisa asked her daughters to go and gather dry branches from the banks of the Gave, the river that flowed through Lourdes, with its icy waters rushing down from the mountain. Bernadette, who had just turned 14, got ready to go out with her younger sister Toinette, 11, and a neighborhood friend named Jeanne Abadie. The three girls put on what little they had to keep warm: woolen hoods, patched shawls, and wooden clogs over their bare feet. Bernadette hesitated for a moment before going out, as her mother had warned her that the damp cold was dangerous for her asthma, but necessity was stronger than caution, and besides, she was the oldest and had to set an example for the younger ones. The three girls walked through the streets of Lourdes until they reached the outskirts of the town, where the Gave River flowed between rocks and meadows toward the valley. They followed the river's course to a place called Massabielle, which in the local language meant Old Rock, a solitary spot where the river made a small bend next to a rock formation containing several natural hollows and grottos. It was a place the inhabitants of Lourdes avoided, as it had a bad reputation. Branches and debris carried by the river ended up there, and it was also where the town's pigs came to graze among the undergrowth. A dirty, forgotten, despised place, one that no one would have chosen for anything important. Toinette and Jeanne went ahead to cross the small channel that separated the riverbank from the main grotto, hiking up their skirts and plunging into the icy water without a second thought. But Bernadette lagged behind, hesitating. The doctor had told her not to get her feet wet if she wanted to avoid making her asthma worse, and the channel water looked terribly cold. She asked the other girls to help her cross without getting wet, but they laughed and told her not to be a coward, that the water wasn't that cold, and to hurry if she didn't want to be left behind. So Bernadette decided to take off her clogs and stockings to cross the canal barefoot, hoping that this would be less harmful than if she got the wool that protected her from the cold wet. She sat down on a rock by the grotto and began to untie her stockings, and it was at that moment, in that precise instant when she was performing such an ordinary and mundane gesture, that something happened that would change her life and the history of the world forever. She heard a noise like the wind, like a sudden gust rustling the leaves of the trees. She looked up at the poplars growing by the river, expecting to see them shake in the breeze, but the trees were completely still, their branches motionless in the cold morning air. Puzzled, she went back to taking off her stocking, but the noise came again, louder this time, a powerful gust like a storm that nevertheless moved nothing around her. And then, looking up at the grotto in front of her, she saw something that stopped her in her tracks. In one of the hollows of the rock, a small, natural niche situated some height above the ground, a light had appeared, a golden glow unlike anything Bernadette had ever seen before. And within that light, standing on the rock as if floating in the air, was a figure. A young woman dressed in white, with a white veil covering her head and falling to her feet, a sky blue sash around her waist, a yellow rose on each bare foot, and a rosary of white beads and a gold chain hanging from her arm. A young woman of indescribable beauty, who gazed at Bernadette with eyes full of infinite tenderness, and smiled at her with a smile that seemed to contain all the sweetness in the world. Bernadette rubbed her eyes, convinced she was dreaming, or that something was wrong with her vision. But when she looked again, the figure was still there, radiant and silent, smiling down at her from the niche in the rock. The girl's heart began to pound, her hands trembled, her breath quickened. She didn't know what to do, what to think, whether to run or stay, whether to scream or remain silent. The only thing she could think of was to reach into her apron pocket for the small rosary she always carried, the worn-out rosary her mother had given her, to make the sign of the cross and protect herself from whatever it was she was seeing. But her hand trembled so much she couldn't lift it. It was as if an invisible force held it immobile, unable to complete the gesture she had made thousands of times before. And then, the figure in the grotto did something Bernadette would never forget. It raised its own hand and slowly crossed itself, with a gesture so solemn and beautiful, it seemed like a prayer in itself. And seeing that gesture, Bernadette's fear vanished like mist in the sunlight. Her hand stopped trembling. She was finally able to make the sign of the cross, and she felt an immense peace envelop her, a peace she had never experienced before, a peace that seemed to come from another world. She began to pray the rosary, running the beads through her fingers as her lips murmured the Our Fathers and Hail Marys she knew by heart. And as she prayed, the figure in the grotto silently accompanied her, also running the beads of her own rosary, though without moving her lips during the prayers. Only at the end of each decade, when Bernadette reached the Glory Be, did the young woman in white bow her head in reverence. Thus the two remained, the poor girl from the dungeon and the radiant lady from the grotto, united in a prayer that seemed to stop time and suspend the world. When the rosary ended, the figure smiled one last time at Bernadette, and then vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving only the bare rock and the echo of the wind that wasn't blowing. Bernadette remained motionless for a long moment, unsure whether what she had just experienced was real or a dream, unsure how to return to normalcy after having glimpsed something that did not belong to this world. Only the shouts of her sister and her friend, who were returning laden with branches and were surprised to see her still sitting by the grotto, brought her back to reality. That night in Cachot, Benedita couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the face of the lady in white, her infinitely sweet smile, her eyes filled with a tenderness no human being could fake. She wanted to tell someone what she had seen, but she was afraid they wouldn't believe her, that they would laugh at her, that they would think she was crazy, or that she was lying for attention. So she kept quiet, at least for the time being, and let the secret burn inside her like a flame that couldn't be extinguished. But the secret could not be kept for long, for that would not be the only time Bernadette would see the lady in the grotto. In the days and weeks that followed, the young woman in white would reappear again and again, 18 times in all, and each appearance would bring new messages, new mysteries, new trials for the girl in the dungeon who had been chosen, without knowing why, to be a witness to heaven. Would you be so kind as to come here for 15 days? The days following that first apparition were a torment of doubt and conflicting longings for Bernadette. On the one hand, she felt an irresistible desire to return to the Grotto of Massabielle, to see again the lady in white who had smiled at her so sweetly, to experience once more that supernatural peace she had felt while they prayed the rosary together. On the other hand, she was afraid that it had all been a figment of her tired and ailing mind, afraid of what others would say if they found out, afraid of disappointing her parents, who already had enough problems without adding a daughter who saw visions. The secret didn't last long. Toinette, Bernadette's younger sister, had noticed something strange about her sister's behavior by the grotto that day, and that night she pressed her until Bernadette, unable to lie, told her what she had seen. Toinette promised to keep it a secret, but she was only 11 years old, and the secret was too big for her. The next day she told her mother, and Louise, alarmed by what she heard, questioned Bernadette with a mixture of concern and anger. What was this about seeing ladies dressed in white in the grottos? Had she gone mad? Did she want to bring more trouble upon the family? Bernadette repeated what she had seen with her characteristic honesty, adding nothing and omitting nothing, without trying to embellish or dramatize it. She had seen a lady dressed in white, with a white veil and a blue sash, and yellow roses at her feet. The lady had smiled at her and prayed the rosary with her. That was all she knew. She didn't know who the lady was, what she wanted, or why she had appeared to her specifically. She only knew what she had seen, and what she had seen was true. Louisa didn't know what to think. Her mother's instinct told her that Bernadette wasn't lying, that her daughter was incapable of inventing such a story, but her practical instinct told her that it could only be a fantasy, a hallucination perhaps caused by asthma or hunger, or the overactive imagination of a pious teenager. She decided to forbid Bernadette from returning to the grotto, hoping that with time she would forget the whole affair and things would go back to normal. But the grotto called to Bernadette with a force she could not resist. On Sunday, February 14th, 3 days after the first apparition, the girl asked her mother for permission to return to Massabielle. Louise refused, but Bernadette insisted with a determination uncharacteristic of her usually docile nature, and finally her mother gave in, perhaps thinking that if the girl returned and saw nothing, she would be convinced that it had all been a dream, and would stop talking about it. Bernadette returned to the grotto, accompanied by several neighborhood girls who had heard the rumors and wanted to see what was happening. She carried with her a bottle of holy water she had obtained from the church, determined to use it to test whether what she saw was from God or the devil, for she had heard that evil spirits flee from holy water, while good spirits are not afraid of it. She knelt before the niche in the rock and began to pray, and almost immediately the lady in white appeared again, as radiant and beautiful as the first time. Bernadette threw the holy water toward the apparition, and the lady, far from fleeing or showing fear, bowed her head and smiled an even sweeter smile, as if thanking her for the gesture. This response reassured Bernadette. What she was seeing could not be the work of the devil. They prayed the rosary together as they had the first time, and when they finished, the lady disappeared, leaving Bernadette in an ecstasy from which the other girls had to awaken her by shaking her shoulders. The third apparition took place on Thursday, February 18th, and it was then that the lady in white spoke for the first time. Bernadette had gone to the grotto, accompanied by 2 women from the village who wanted to witness what was happening, and she had brought paper and a pen to ask the lady to write her name, for she thought that in this way she would have proof that what she was seeing was real. But when she offered her the paper, the lady smiled and said, in the Gascon dialect spoken by the inhabitants of Lourdes, words that Bernadette would never forget. "There's no need to write what I have to say," the lady said in a voice that Bernadette would later describe as the sweetest she had ever heard. Then she added, "Would you be so kind as to come here for 15 days? You want to have kindness." That phrase, so courteous, so respectful, was etched in Bernadette's heart like a treasure. The lady in white, that radiant figure who seemed to belong to another world, addressed her, the poor, ignorant girl in the dungeon, with the formal "usted," and asked for things with a gentleness Bernadette had never experienced. No one in her life had ever spoken to her like that, with such respect, such consideration. The townspeople treated her like a servant. The children mocked her. Even her own teachers considered her a clumsy and limited child. But this lady, this celestial presence, treated her as if she were someone precious, someone worthy of respect. "Yes," Bernadette replied without hesitation, "I will come." And then the lady added something else, something that would sound strange in any other circumstance, but that Bernadette accepted with the same naturalness with which she had accepted everything else. "I do not promise to make you happy in this world, but in the next." Perhaps tonight, as you listen to these words, a part of you resonates with this strange promise. Perhaps you have searched for happiness in this world and not found it, or found it only to lose it afterward. Perhaps you wonder why life has to be so difficult, why suffering seems to be an inseparable companion of human existence, why God allows his children to pass through such dark valleys. If so, listen to what Our Lady of Lourdes said to Bernadette. "I do not promise to make you happy in this world, but in the next." It is not a denial of happiness, but a redefinition of it. Not a rejection of comfort, but an invitation to seek a deeper and more lasting comfort than anything this world can offer. Bernadette kept her promise. For the next 15 days, she returned to the grotto every morning before dawn, walking through the dark streets of Lourdes with her rosary in hand and her heart filled with expectation. And each day, the lady in white awaited her in the niche in the rock, radiant and smiling, to pray with her and gradually convey a message that would change the world. News of the apparitions spread through Lourdes like wildfire. At first, only the locals came to the grotto to see the girl who had visions, but soon curious onlookers arrived from all over the town, then from neighboring villages, and then from the entire region. What had begun as a secret between a little girl and a lady in white had become a public event, drawing ever larger crowds. And with the crowds came the problems. The civil authorities of Lourdes, concerned about public order, began to keep a close watch on Bernadette and her family. The police commissioner interrogated her several times, trying to make her contradict herself, searching for lies or inconsistencies in her story. The imperial procurator threatened to send her to prison if she continued to disturb the peace of the town with her supposed visions. Doctors examined her, looking for signs of mental illness or hysteria. Priests questioned her with suspicion, fearful that it was all a deception of the devil or the fantasy of an ignorant mind. But Bernadette refused to be intimidated. Faced with every question, every threat, every pressure, she always gave the same answer with a serenity that disconcerted her interrogators. She had seen a lady dressed in white. The lady had asked her to come to the grotto for 15 days. That was all she knew. She wasn't tasked with making them believe anything. She was tasked with telling them what she had seen. If they believed her, fine. If they didn't, that was fine too. She was simply doing what the lady had asked of her. "I am charged with telling you, not making you believe." This phrase, which Bernadette would repeat countless times throughout her life, perfectly summarizes her attitude toward the world. She was not a preacher or a missionary. She didn't try to convince anyone or win followers to her cause. She was simply a witness, someone who had seen something and recounted it exactly as she had seen it, letting each person draw their own conclusion. This humility, this complete lack of pretension, was precisely what made her testimony so credible. Liars and madmen usually strive to convince, to prove, to accumulate evidence and arguments. Bernadette did none of that. She simply recounted what she had seen, with the same naturalness with which she would have described what she had for breakfast that morning. And while the authorities questioned her and the crowds watched, the lady in white continued to appear every day in the grotto, gradually conveying her message to that girl whom the world considered insignificant, but whom heaven had chosen for an extraordinary mission. Penance, penance, penance. As the days of the promised fortnight passed, the apparitions gradually revealed their meaning. The lady in white didn't speak much. Most of the time she remained silent, smiling at Bernadette and praying the rosary with her, while the crowds gathered at the foot of the grotto watched, fascinated, the transfigured face of the little girl. But when she did speak, her words were simple and direct, words that any peasant in the Pyrenees could understand, words that nevertheless contained a depth that the wisest theologians would take years to understand. On February 21st, during the 6th apparition, the lady uttered a word that she would repeat several times in the following days, a word that would become the heart of the Lord's message. Looking at Bernadette with an expression of infinite tenderness and at the same time profound seriousness, the lady said, "Penance, penance, penance. Pray to God for sinners. Penance." In a world that seeks pleasure and flees from pain, that considers suffering an enemy to be eliminated and sacrifice a relic of the past, this word sounds strange, almost offensive. Why should someone who already suffers as much as Bernadette do penance? Why should she add more pain to a life already filled with deprivation and illness? What kind of God asks his children to suffer more than they already do? But the penance the Lady of Lourdes spoke of was neither punishment nor pointless mortification. It was something much deeper. It was voluntary participation in Christ's redemptive suffering, the offering of one's own pain for the salvation of others, the transformation of inevitable suffering into saving love. Bernadette already suffered from her poverty, her illness, and the scorn of others. The lady did not ask her to suffer more, but rather to offer up what she already suffered, to give it meaning, to transform it into prayer for those who do not know how to pray, into sacrifice for those who do not know how to love. Perhaps you too know suffering tonight. Perhaps there is a pain in your body or soul that keeps you from resting, that has brought you here seeking a little. If so, I want you to listen to what Our Lady of Lourdes has to say to you across the ages. Your suffering is not in vain. It can be offered up. It can be transformed. It can become something precious in the eyes of God. You don't have to add anything to what you already endure. You only have to say yes. You only have to surrender what you already carry, and heaven will receive it like the most fragrant incense. 4 days later, on February 25th, one of the most extraordinary and perplexing episodes of all the apparitions took place. That day, the crowd gathered at the foot of the grotto was larger than ever. It is said that 350 people were crammed into that narrow space, silently watching Bernadette as she prayed on her knees before the niche in the rock. The lady in white appeared as usual, and after they prayed the rosary together, she said something to Bernadette that the girl did not understand at first. "Go drink from the spring and wash yourself in it," said the lady, "and eat some of the grass you'll find there." Bernadette looked around, puzzled. There was no spring in Massabielle, only the Gave River flowing some distance from the grotto. She thought the lady wanted her to go to the river, so she started walking in that direction. But the lady stopped her with a gesture and pointed to a spot inside the grotto, a corner where there was nothing but earth and mud. Bernadette went to that spot, knelt down, and began to dig with her hands in the muddy ground. What happened next left all who witnessed it perplexed. Bernadette, the girl who had always been so clean and dignified despite her poverty, was now wallowing in the mud like an animal. She dug in the earth with her bare hands, brought the mud to her mouth trying to drink water that wasn't there, and stained her face and clothes with the grime from the ground. The onlookers began to murmur, first with bewilderment, then with indignation. "This girl is crazy," some said. "She's a fraud," others said. "She's lost her mind, poor thing." Bernadette tried to drink from the mud 3 times, and 3 times she found nothing but wet earth. But on the 4th try, her fingers touched something different, a trickle of water beginning to seep from the earth she had dug up. It was murky water at first, mixed with the mud that had covered her for who knows how many centuries. But Bernadette brought it to her lips and drank as the lady had instructed. She also plucked some herbs that grew nearby and chewed them, obeying the instructions she had received to the very end. When she finally stood up and turned to face the crowd, her face was covered in mud, her clothes stained. She looked like a mad woman or a woman possessed. Some of those present openly mocked her. Others walked away in outrage, and still others shook their heads with a mixture of pity and contempt. The spectacle was over, many thought, and it had ended badly. The girl who claimed to see the Virgin Mary was nothing more than a poor, deranged woman. But what no one could have known at that moment was that something extraordinary was happening beneath the grotto. The trickle of water Bernadette had discovered began to grow, to gain strength, to push its way through the rocks with a determination that seemed supernatural. In the following hours, what had been a muddy puddle became a spring, and the spring a fountain that has flowed continuously ever since. 100,000 litres of water every day for more than 160 years, flowing without interruption from the exact spot where the fingers of a poor girl had dug in the mud, following the instructions of a lady dressed in white. The water from that spring, analysed time and again by scientists from around the world, has no special chemical properties. It is ordinary drinking water, similar to any water from the Pyrenees, with no miraculous component to distinguish it. And yet, since it began to flow, that water has witnessed thousands of inexplicable healings, of terminally ill patients who regained their health, of the blind who saw again, of the paralyzed who walked once more. It is not the water that heals, believers will say, but the faith of those who drink it and bathe in it. But whatever the explanation, the fact remains. Where before there was nothing but mud and refuse, now a spring of hope flows for millions of people worldwide. That night, as Bernadette washed the mud from her face in Cachot, her mother watched her with a mixture of love and worry that only mothers know. What was happening to her daughter? Was what she was saying true, or was she losing her mind? Louisa had no answers, but she had faith. And her faith told her that God would not abandon her child, that all of this had to have some meaning, even if she couldn't see it yet. And while the family slept, huddled together in that damp dungeon, the water from the fountain continued to flow in the darkness of the grotto, setting the stage for the miracles that were to come. I am the Immaculate Conception. During the weeks that followed, Bernadette continued to faithfully visit the Grotto of Massabielle, and the lady in white continued to appear with the same regularity and gentleness as always. The message gradually came together, like a mosaic whose pieces fall into place to reveal an image that was initially impossible to see. Prayer and penance for sinners, a spring of water gushing forth where before there had been nothing, and now a request that Bernadette was to convey to the church authorities. On March the 2nd, during the 13th apparition, the lady told Bernadette, "Go and tell the priest that I want a chapel built here. I want them to come here in procession." Bernadette obeyed as always, even though the task terrified her. She, the ignorant girl in the dungeon, had to appear before the parish priest of Lourdes, the stern Father Dominique Peramal, and deliver a message from a lady whom no one else could see. She could already imagine the priest's reaction, his disbelief, his possible anger, his rejection. But the lady had asked her to do it, and Bernadette didn't know how to disobey her. Father Peramal was a man of strong character, an old-school priest who deeply distrusted visions and miracles, who had seen too many cases of religious hysteria and pious frauds to be impressed by the tales of a peasant girl. When Bernadette appeared before him and conveyed the lady's message, the parish priest looked at her with a mixture of skepticism and annoyance. "And who is this lady who keeps asking you for chapels and processions?" he asked sternly. "Does she have a name? Do you know who she is?" Bernadette had to admit that she didn't know. The lady had never told her name. She only knew that she was very beautiful, that she wore white with a blue sash, that she had yellow roses at her feet and a rosary in her hand. But her name, her identity, remained a mystery. Father Pyrenees dismissed Bernadette without giving her an answer, but made it clear that he would not build any chapel or organize any procession until he knew exactly who the lady making such requests was. If she wanted to be taken seriously, she would have to get a name. Bernadette returned to the grotto and relayed the priest's demand to the lady. Again and again she asked her name, but the lady only smiled and didn't answer. Days passed, the apparitions continued, and the mystery of the lady in white's identity remained unsolved. Bernadette was beginning to despair. How could she convince the priest if she didn't even know who she was seeing? The answer came on March 25th, 1858, exactly 40 days after the first apparition. It was the Feast of the Annunciation, the day the church celebrates the moment when the angel Gabriel visited a young woman named Mary in a town called Nazareth and announced that she would be the mother of the Saviour. Bernadette was unaware of this coincidence. She barely knew what day it was, much less what feast the church was celebrating. But heaven did know, and had chosen that day to finally reveal the secret Bernadette had been waiting for weeks. That morning, Bernadette arrived at the grotto before dawn, as usual. The lady appeared in the niche of the rock, radiant as always, and Bernadette took the opportunity to ask her once again the question she had been asked so many times. "Madam, would you be so kind as to tell me who you are?" The lady smiled, and for a moment, Bernadette thought she would remain silent again, as she had all the previous time. But then, the figure in white clasped her hands to her chest, raised her eyes to the sky, and uttered words that Bernadette didn't understand, but memorized perfectly so she could repeat them later. "I am Immaculada Concepciu. I am the Immaculate Conception." Bernadette ran out of the grotto, repeating the words aloud so she wouldn't forget them, through the streets of Lourdes until she reached the parish priest's house. She entered without knocking, interrupting Father Pyrenees at his breakfast, and blurted out the message she carried. "The lady says she is the Immaculate Conception." Father Pyrenees froze. He knew those words perfectly. He knew exactly what they meant. Just 4 years earlier, on December 8, 1854, Pope Pius IX had solemnly proclaimed the dogma of the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary, declaring that the Mother of God had been preserved from all sin from the first instant of her conception. It was a new dogma, a complex theological definition that not even all priests fully understood. How could an illiterate 14-year-old girl who couldn't read or write, who barely knew the basic catechism, pronounce those words with such precision? "Do you know what that means?" the parish priest asked, his voice trembling. "No," Bernadette replied with her usual honesty. "I don't know what it means, but that's what the lady told me, and I've been repeating it all the way here so I wouldn't forget." Father Pyrenees dismissed Bernadette without another word, but as the girl left, the stern parish priest of Lourdes slumped into a chair and wept. For at that moment, he knew, with a certainty beyond all proof and demonstration, that the lady of the Grotto of Massabielle was the Virgin Mary, the Mother of God, the Immaculate Conception. And he also knew that God had chosen the smallest, the most ignorant, the most despised in his parish, to reveal to the world a message that the wise and the powerful would not have known how to receive. "I am the Immaculate Conception." Those words, spoken in a peasant dialect by a girl who didn't understand their meaning, contained a theological revelation of a depth that scholars would take decades to unravel. The Virgin Mary hadn't said, "I am the woman immaculately conceived," but rather, "I am the Immaculate Conception." She identified herself not only with the grace she had received, but with grace itself, as if her entire being were defined by that original purity that God had bestowed upon her. It was an affirmation of identity, a revelation of essence that no human theologian would have dared to formulate, and yet it flowed naturally from the lips of the Mother of God. And the Mother of God had chosen to reveal herself not in a cathedral or a palace, not to a bishop or a king, but in a filthy grotto where the village pigs were kept, to a sick and illiterate girl who lived in an abandoned dungeon. This is how heaven works, always choosing what the world despises to manifest its glory, choosing the lowly to confound the great, revealing its deepest secrets to those who have nothing to offer except a heart willing to receive. The strength of the small. The months following the revelation of the Lady in White's identity were an ordeal for Bernadette, marked by interrogations, pressure, and harassment that would have broken anyone less grounded in the truth. The civil authorities of Lourdes, who at first had viewed the apparitions as a minor nuisance, began to take them very seriously when they saw the crowds flocking to the grotto and the growing religious fervour in the region. Police Commissioner Jacomet interrogated Bernadette repeatedly, trying by all means to make her contradict herself, to find inconsistencies in her account, to extract a confession that it had all been a lie or a figment of her imagination. But Bernadette never contradicted herself. Her story was always the same, with the same details, in the same order, without variations or embellishments. She had seen a lady dressed in white. The lady had spoken to her in Gascon. She had asked her to come for 15 days. She had told her to pray for sinners. She had shown her where the spring was. She had asked her to convey to the priests her wish that a chapel be built. She had revealed its name, the Immaculate Conception. That was all. She knew no more. She didn't pretend to know more, and she had no intention of inventing anything to satisfy anyone's curiosity. The commissioner threatened to send her to jail if she continued to cause a disturbance with her story. Bernadette replied with a serenity that left him speechless. "If they send me to jail, I'll pray the rosary there just as I do here." The imperial procurator had her examined by doctors who looked for signs of mental illness, but the doctors found nothing abnormal about her. No symptoms of hysteria, hallucination, or any other disorder. Bernadette was perfectly sane, and that was precisely what most baffled the authority. Perhaps you too have known what it is like to be questioned, interrogated, doubted by people who have power over you. Perhaps you have had to defend a truth that no one else could see, to uphold a testimony that no one else wanted to believe. If so, then you can understand what Bernadette experienced during those months, and you can also learn from her what it means to stand firm without losing your peace. Bernadette didn't get angry with her interrogators. She didn't insult them or defy them. She simply repeated what she had seen again and again, with the same calm and the same clarity, and let them draw their own conclusions. "I am charged with telling you, not making you believe it." This phrase, which Bernadette uttered so many times during those interrogations, reveals the secret of her strength. She did not consider herself responsible for convincing anyone. She felt no pressure to prove anything or to win any debate. Her only responsibility was to tell the truth, and she fulfilled that responsibility every time she opened her mouth. What others did with that truth was none of her business. This inner freedom, this absence of need for approval, made her invulnerable to any pressure that might be exerted upon her. The apparitions continued until July 16th, 1858, when the Virgin appeared for the 18th and final time. That time, she did not speak. She only smiled at Bernadette with a farewell smile, and then disappeared forever. Bernadette would never again see the Lady in White on this earth, but she would carry her in her heart until the last day of her life. Meanwhile, The case of the apparitions continued its course through the ecclesiastical authorities. The Bishop of Tarbes, Bertrand Sévère-Laurence, had ordered an official investigation to determine whether Bernadette's visions were authentic. For 4 years, a commission of priests, theologians, and doctors examined all the testimonies, questioned all the witnesses, and studied every detail of what had happened in Massabielle. On December 1st, 1860, Bernadette was questioned for the last time before the commission, and the elderly bishop, who had listened with skepticism to so many accounts of alleged apparitions throughout his life, was deeply moved to see this simple girl repeat the Virgin's gesture and words, "I am the Immaculate Conception." On January 18th, 1862, more than 3 years after the last apparition, the Bishop of Tarbes finally published his pastoral letter with the official verdict of the Church. The Immaculate Mother of God truly appeared to Bernadette Soubirous. The apparitions of Lourdes were recognized as authentic, and devotion to Our Lady of Lourdes was officially approved. By then, Bernadette's fame had spread throughout France and beyond. Thousands of people wanted to meet her, talk to her, touch her, ask for her blessing. Journalists hounded her for interviews. Photographers wanted to take her picture, and curious onlookers mobbed her in the streets of Lourdes. Bernadette became, much against her will, a celebrity, and she found the celebrity unbearable. She never sought fame or recognition. She never wanted to be the center of attention. When offered money to tell her story, she indignantly refused. When offered the chance to go to Paris and make her rich and famous, she said no with an unwavering firmness. All she wanted was to live in peace, to pray, to serve others as best she could, and to prepare herself to find in the afterlife the happiness the Lady had promised her. And it was precisely this desire for peace and service that led her to make the most important decision of her life, to enter a convent. Ever since she had met the Sisters of Charity of Nevers at the hospice in Lourdes, she had felt drawn to that life of prayer and dedication to the poor and sick. Now, after all she had experienced, that attraction had become a certainty. Her place was there, among the sisters, far from the crowds and the interrogations, serving the needy as the Virgin Mary had served her Son throughout her life. "I like the poor. I like caring for the sick. I'll stay with the Sisters of Nevers," Bernadette said, when asked why she had chosen that congregation. "They didn't force me to join, and that's why I'm staying." On July 7, 1866, Bernadette Soubirous crossed the threshold of the mother house of the Sisters of Charity in Nevers, more than 700 kilometers from Lourdes. She was 22 years old and carried with her little more than the clothes she was wearing and the rosary she had held in her hands during the apparitions. She was leaving behind her family, her village, the grotto where she had seen the Virgin, everything she knew and loved, but she knew she was going where God was calling her, and that was enough. The day after her arrival, gathered with the 300 sisters of the convent, Bernadette recounted the story of the apparitions for the last time in public. It was a simple account, without drama or embellishment, the same story she had told hundreds of times before. And when she finished, she closed that chapter of her life forever. She would never again speak of the apparitions in public. What she had seen in Massabielle remained sealed in her heart, a secret treasure known in all its depth only to her and the Virgin Mary. Farewell to Lourdes, the silence of never. Bernadette's arrival at the mother house of the Sisters of Charity in Nevers marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one very different from anything she had known before. Behind her lay the Pyrenees mountains, the Gave River with its crystal clear waters, the grotto of Massabielle where heaven seemed to touch earth. Behind her too lay her family, her parents and siblings, whom she would see only on rare occasions. Bernadette was entering a new world, the world of the cloister, where the rules were strict, the schedules inflexible, and life itself was oriented toward a single goal: personal sanctification through prayer and service to others. The moment Bernadette crossed the threshold of the house, she could read the words engraved on the stone of the facade: Deus caritas est. God is love. These words encapsulated the spirit of the congregation founded by Jean-Baptiste de Lavenne, a priest who had dedicated his life to the poor and sick of 18th century France. The Sisters of Charity of Nevers followed that same spirit. Their mission was to serve the most needy, care for the sick in hospitals, educate poor children in schools, and bring comfort to those who suffered. It was exactly the life Bernadette had dreamed of, a life of quiet and anonymous service, far from the crowds that had besieged her in Lourdes. But life in the convent would not be easy for her. From the beginning, Bernadette had to face a reality that caused her profound suffering. Many of the sisters did not believe in her visions. The novice mistress, Mother Marie-Thérèse Vauzou, was particularly skeptical. She considered the entire story of the apparitions to be the fantasy of an ignorant and superstitious mind, and she treated Bernadette with a coldness that sometimes bordered on cruelty. She granted her no privileges, showed her no special consideration, and took every opportunity to remind her that in the convent she was nothing more than a novice like the others, with no particular merit to distinguish her. This attitude, which at first glance might seem unjust, also had its providential side. Bernadette had not entered the convent to be admired, but to be forgotten, not to receive honours, but to serve in anonymity. Mother Vauzou's harshness, however painful, helped her to rid herself of any remaining vanity or attachment to her past fame. Every time she was treated harshly, every time she was humiliated or ignored, Bernadette had the opportunity to offer that suffering as the penance the Virgin had asked of her in Massabielle. Perhaps you too have known the pain of not being understood by those who should support you, of being treated unfairly by those from whom you expected understanding and affection. If so, the story of Bernadette in Nevers can be a source of comfort and a lesson for you. She didn't complain, she didn't protest, she didn't demand to be treated differently. She accepted everything that came with a serenity that can only be born from a deep faith that God knows what He is doing, even if we don't understand it. Bernadette's daily life in the convent was simple and repetitive. She rose before dawn for morning prayers, attended Mass, ate breakfast in silence with the other sisters, and then dedicated herself to the tasks assigned to her. At first, she was a nurse's assistant in the convent infirmary, caring for the elderly and sick sisters. It was a job she loved, as it allowed her to put into practice the love for the poor and the sick that had led her to choose this congregation. Bernadette had a special gift for caring for those who suffered. Her presence conveyed peace, her smile eased pain, and her hands seemed to possess a tenderness that transcended the merely human. But her health, which had always been fragile, began to deteriorate rapidly. The asthma that had plagued her since childhood worsened in the damp climate of Nevers, so different from the dry air of the Pyrenees. New ailments followed, digestive problems that prevented her from eating normally, bone pain that made every movement torture, and finally a tumour on her knee that doctors diagnosed as bone tuberculosis, an incurable disease at the time. Bernadette spent increasingly more time in the infirmary, but now as a patient rather than a caregiver. Periods of relative improvement alternated with acute crises that left her bedridden for weeks. The pain was constant, sometimes unbearable, but she accepted it with a resignation that astonished those around her. "I will not live a single moment of my life without loving," she had written in her personal notebook. And that was precisely her way of living, transforming every moment, even the most painful, into an act of love. The sisters who lived with her in the infirmary began to see something Mother Vauzou refused to acknowledge, that this sick and seemingly insignificant young woman was an extraordinary person, a saint in the deepest sense of the word, not because she performed miracles or had visions, but because of the way she lived each day, the peace she radiated even in the midst of suffering, the joy that never left her even when she had 1,000 reasons to be sad. Sister Bernadette, as she was now called, had a jovial nature that surprised those who expected to find in her a serious and austere mystic. She liked to joke with the other sisters, tell funny stories of her childhood in Lourdes, and laugh at her own limitations and clumsiness. When asked how she could be so cheerful despite all her suffering, she would reply with her usual frankness, "Suffering is my profession, and one must do one's profession well." This ability to find meaning and even joy in pain was perhaps the greatest miracle of her life, greater than all the apparitions at Massabielle. Meanwhile, 700 kilometers away, Lourdes had been completely transformed. The small grotto where Bernadette had seen the Virgin had become a sanctuary attracting pilgrims from all over France and Europe. The chapel the lady had requested had been built, then a larger chapel, and then an imposing basilica that dominated the landscape with its Gothic towers. The spring Bernadette had discovered digging in the mud continued to flow, and its waters were channeled into pools where the sick immersed themselves, hoping. Miracles multiplied, inexplicable cures accumulated, and the name of Lourdes became known throughout the world. But Bernadette took no part in any of it. Enclosed in her convent in Nevers, far from the crowds and the miracles, she lived her hidden and silent life like a seed buried in the earth. She never returned to Lourdes after entering the convent. She never saw the basilica built over the grotto where she had spoken with the Virgin. She never bathed in the waters of the spring she herself had discovered. Her only connection to it all was the occasional news and the letters she received from her family, which became less frequent as the years went by. When asked if she wouldn't like to return to Lourdes, if she didn't miss the grotto and the apparitions, Bernadette would reply with a serenity that perhaps concealed a touch of nostalgia. "The Virgin didn't promise to make me happy in this world, but in the next. There I will see her, and it will be more beautiful. Ground like a grain of wheat." The last years of Bernadette's life were a slow and painful descent toward death, a path of suffering she endured with a strength that could only come from grace. The bone tuberculosis she had been diagnosed with progressed relentlessly, slowly destroying the bones of her knee and then spreading to other parts of her body. Added to this was the pulmonary tuberculosis that attacked her lungs, already weakened by her lifelong asthma. Every breath was an effort, every movement torture, and yet Bernadette continued to smile, continued to pray, continued to offer all her suffering for the salvation of sinners. From 1875 onward, her story becomes intertwined with the story of her illnesses. The periods when she could rise and perform her duties in the convent grew shorter and shorter, and the periods confined to her infirmary bed grew longer and longer. Her superiors relieved her of her duties as a nurse's assistant and assigned her lighter tasks, such as sacristan of the convent chapel. But even these proved too much for her exhausted body. The nights were especially difficult. Asthma choked her, preventing her from breathing normally, and when she managed to sleep, the pain would soon wake her. Some of the sisters who shared the infirmary with her heard her weeping softly in the darkness, not from despair, but from sheer physical exhaustion. But when dawn broke and someone asked her how she felt, Bernadette always answered with a smile. "Better, thank God," even though everyone knew it would. Perhaps tonight, as you listen to these words, you too know what it is like to have unrelenting pain, suffering that settles in your body like a guest that refuses to leave. Perhaps you have an illness that accompanies you, an ailment that doctors cannot cure, a chronic discomfort that steals your strength and your joy for life. If so, Bernadette understands you from the depths of her own experience. She knew what it is to suffer without hope of improvement, what it is to see your own body deteriorate day after day, what it is to face the prospect of a slow and painful death. And yet, she never stopped trusting in God's love. She never stopped offering her suffering as a silent prayer for others. In December of 1877, Bernadette was forced to take to her bed due to excruciating pain in her ailing knee. She could no longer walk, she could barely move, and every small gesture required a supreme effort. The doctors who examined her confirmed what everyone suspected. The tumor had grown, the disease had progressed. There was nothing to be done except alleviate the pain as much as possible. Bernadette received the news with the same serenity with which she had received everything else in her life. She didn't complain. She didn't protest against the injustice of her fate. She didn't ask why God allowed her to suffer so much. Instead, she uttered a phrase that encapsulates her entire spirituality. "I am crushed like a grain of wheat." It was a reference to Jesus' words in the Gospel. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Bernadette understood her suffering as a participation in the mystery of the cross, as a death that would bear fruit for the life of the world. In February of 1878, she suffered a serious relapse that left her on the brink of death. The doctors gave her no hope, and the sisters began to prepare for the end. Bernadette received the sacrament of the sick and said goodbye to the few people close to her at the convent. But against all odds, she survived that crisis, although she was left even weaker than before. The following months were a slow decline. Bernadette could no longer get out of bed. She could barely speak, and the pain was so intense that she sometimes lost consciousness. The bed sores, caused by lying down for so long, added to all the suffering she already endured. The sisters who cared for her marveled that she could bear so much pain without losing her peace or her faith. During those last months, Bernadette wrote some notes in her personal notebook that reveal the depth of her inner life. "Oh Jesus," she wrote, "I beg you, give me the bread of humility, the bread of obedience, the bread of charity, the bread of strength to break my will and melt it into yours, the bread of inner detachment, the bread of patience to bear the sorrows my heart suffers." It was a litany of petitions that showed what truly mattered to her. Not the healing of her body, but the sanctification of her soul. "Oh my Jesus, how much I love you," she wrote in another note. "I will not forget anyone." These words, written when she barely had the strength to hold her pen, reveal Bernadette's heart. A heart full of love for God and others. A heart that even on the threshold of death continued to think of those she was leaving behind, promising them that she would not forget them when she was in heaven. Spring in 1879 arrived in Nevis with its flowers and light, but Bernadette could no longer see it. Confined to her bed in the infirmary, her eyes closed most of the time, she awaited death as one awaits a friend who is slow to arrive. On April 15th, a bishop arrived on his way to Rome, and Bernadette asked him to take a letter to the Pope requesting his blessing. The bishop promised to do so, and upon returning from Rome, he brought with him a special blessing from Leo III and a silver crucifix that the Pope sent as a gift. Bernadette received the crucifix with tears of joy. She pressed it to her breast, kissed it again and again, and refused to part with it for the remaining hours of her life. It was the last gift she would receive in this world, and she received it from the hands of the Vicar of Christ, the successor of Peter, the one to whom the Virgin had entrusted her message. The circle was complete. The girl from the dungeon who had seen the Mother of God in a filthy grotto now received the Pope's blessing in a hospital bed. Heaven and earth met once more around that small, suffering figure. "I've seen her again. How beautiful she is." Wednesday, April 16th, 1879, dawned cloudy over Nevis, with that grey French spring sky that can't quite decide between rain and sun. In the infirmary of the Saint-Gildard convent, Sister Marie Bernadette Soubirous, the girl who had seen the Virgin at Lourdes, was living her last hours. She was 35 years old, but her body, ravaged by illness, resembled that of an old woman. The sisters who surrounded her prayed in hushed tones, preparing themselves for the moment they all knew was near. Bernadette had spent the previous night between sleep and wakefulness, murmuring prayers only she could hear. From time to time, she uttered isolated words that the sisters tried to decipher. Mary, Mother, Forgiveness, Sinners. They were the same words she had heard in the Grotto of Massabielle 21 years before. The echo of a message that had never ceased to resonate in her heart. Early that morning, she asked for a drink. And when the glass was brought to her lips, she whispered in a barely audible voice, "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for me, a poor sinner." These were the words of the Hail Mary, the prayer she had recited so many times beside the lady in white, the prayer that had been the guiding thread of her entire life. Even now, on the threshold of death, Bernadette continued to pray. Around 11 in the morning, she seemed to regain some strength. She opened her eyes, looked at the sisters surrounding her, and asked them to help her sit up a little in bed. When they did, she stretched out her arms as if she wanted to embrace something or someone only she could see. And her face, which had been contorted with pain for so many months, lit up with a smile of indescribable happiness. The sisters stared at her, bewildered. Bernadette, her eyes fixed on a point that seemed beyond the walls of the infirmary, beyond the visible world, then uttered the last words that would ever pass her lips. "I have seen her again. How beautiful she is. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for me, a poor sinner, a poor sinner." And having said this, he bowed his head and expired. It was 3:15 in the afternoon, the same hour that Jesus had died on the cross according to gospel tradition. The girl from the dungeon, the visionary of Lourdes, the sick sister of Nevers, had finished her earthly pilgrimage. The lady in white who had promised to make her happy not in this world but in the next had come to find her and fulfill that promise. The sisters who witnessed her death were deeply moved by the peace that radiated from her face. Every trace of pain had vanished, replaced by an expression of serenity and joy that none of them had ever seen before in a dying person. It seemed as if, at the moment of death, Bernadette had glimpsed something so beautiful that it had instantly erased all the suffering of her life. News of her death spread quickly through Nevers, and then throughout France. Crowds flocked to the convent to see the visionary of Lourdes one last time, and the funeral became a demonstration of faith and devotion that astonished even the sisters themselves. "The saint is dead," everyone said, although the church would still take more than 50 years to officially proclaim her as such. Bernadette's body was buried in the chapel of St. Joseph within the convent grounds. But her story did not end with her death. When, 30 years later, her tomb was opened for the beatification process, the doctors who examined her remains found something extraordinary. Bernadette's body was intact, without any signs of decomposition, as if she had just died. The same girl who had lived in extreme poverty, who had suffered terrible illnesses, who had been despised and forgotten by the world, had received from God the gift of incorruptibility, a visible sign of the holiness she had attained. Today, almost 150 years after her death, Bernadette's body remains on display in a glass reliquary in the chapel of the convent in Nevers. Millions of pilgrims from all over the world come every year to see her, to pray to her, to ask for her intercession. And in Lourdes, the sanctuary that grew up around the grotto where she saw the Virgin Mary, receives more than 6 million visitors each year, making it one of the most important pilgrimage sites in the Christian world. 72 miracles have been officially recognized by the Church as a result of the healings that occurred in Lourdes, but the testimonies of graces received number in the millions. The sick who recovered their health, the desperate who found hope, sinners who returned to God, families who were reconciled, broken hearts that were healed. All of this began on that February morning in 1858, when a poor, sick girl went to gather firewood on the banks of the river and found something infinitely more precious, the face of the Mother of God. But perhaps the greatest miracle of Lourdes is not the physical healings, but the conversions of the heart. Perhaps the most important thing is not the water of the spring, but the message that the Virgin Mary conveyed through Bernadette. Prayer and penance for sinners, love for the poor and the sick, and trust that God does not forget the least among us, even when the world ignores them. This message continues to resonate today with the same force as it did more than a century and a half ago, because the needs of the human heart have not changed. We continue to seek hope in the midst of suffering, light in the midst of darkness, and love in the midst of loneliness. And now, as this night draws near to dawn, as silence envelops your room like a protective cloak, allow yourself to rest in the peace that Bernadette found after so much suffering. She knew the most extreme poverty and found her wealth in God. She knew the scorn of others and found her solace in the Virgin Mary. She knew the most intense pain and found its meaning in the cross of Christ. All that she suffered was transformed into gold by the fire of divine love, and all that you suffer tonight can also be transformed if you place it in the hands of Him who makes all things new. You are not alone tonight. You are not alone. The same mother who appeared to Bernadette in the Grotto of Massabielle accompanies you now, looks at you with the same eyes of infinite tenderness, smiles at you with the same smile that made the girl in the dungeon weep with joy. She does not promise to make you happy in this world, but she promises you something better, to make you happy forever in that other world where there is no pain or crying or death, where all tears will be wiped away and all questions will be answered. Close your eyes and rest. Let the peace of Christ descend upon you, like the morning dew upon the wildflowers. Let Our Lady of Lourdes cover you with her blue mantle and cradle you with her maternal presence. Let Saint Bernadette, from heaven, where she now beholds the face of the one she saw on earth, intercede for you and accompany you this night and every night of your life. The suffering you know now is not the end of your story. It is only one chapter, perhaps the most difficult, but not the last. After night always comes dawn, and after winter always comes spring. God, who began a good work in you, will bring it to completion. What now seems dark will be filled with light. What now seems meaningless will find its purpose. What now seems lost will be found. May the God of all consolation comfort you this night. May the Virgin Mary keep you under her protection. May Saint Bernadette teach you the secret of finding joy even in sorrow. And may you find in your heart tomorrow, when you awaken, a peace that the world cannot give or take away. And may the Lord give you peace. Amen. This has been Saints to Sleep By. Come back soon for more stories of saints to keep you company at night. Until then, may the peace of Christ dwell in your heart. Rest well.